welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton. And today we're going to tell you about a new book that talks about the history of Phoebus. And the author is here with us today, Tim Receveur. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for having me.
It's really, it's fun because I think Phoebus is such a rich place. I mean, the stories, the legends are just rich there. What interested you about this?
So we had just moved back to Hampton. We used to live in the area back in the 90s. So we moved to Phoebus in August and found it really interesting, the history of kind of the proximity to Fort Monroe and the Civil War history. And we heard a lot of stories from the locals about the riots that have happened there, and a lot of stories that we wanted to kind of go back and see what the truth was behind it. They're interesting, but dug a lot into that. So that's kind of what started it.
So it started with your house. You have one of the older houses, like a Victorian?
We do. We have a Victorian, and we think that there's a restaurant called Fuller's that's been was open for about 100 years.
Yes.
And kind of it's a legend in Hampton, and we think that the guy P.A. Fuller that built our house because he was an architect and a builder and built these old Victorians in Hampton at the time.
Yeah, he did. He built quite a few.
Yeah, so that's kind of, we started with that and thinking, we've heard that he built these Victorians, and so we're looking to see what that connection was, and found out that he built a house for William Trusty, who was an African American that was elected to the town council. He built the house for Trusty, who had the most expensive house in town, which was kind of interesting. It's like that, at that time period and everything, you just don't think of that. And then look into it a little deeper, and William Trusty is elected, in 1901 in the first election in Phoebus to the town council.
Now let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that is one of the interesting, at least myths about Phoebus, and it looks, through your book that a lot of it is true, is that it was less racially divided than a lot of Virginia communities. Certainly there was always going to be a gap and people were not treated fairly. I'm not trying to say they were, but Phoebus was weirdly independent and a little different.
Yeah, and it's very entrepreneurial at that time. Like I think what some of the big things that happen is you have a proximity to Fort Monroe, like I said, and so then you've got these kind of attitudes, these northern attitudes, and especially during Reconstruction that are there. You have the first community for freed slaves in the South is in Phoebus, and you have a lot of freed blacks that were even, before the Civil War even were in business and kind of, buying property.
Yeah, it's the pre-Civil War part that actually interests me the most, because in Reconstruction, it was sort of enforced, but Phoebus had that history before and kept it long after, whereas a lot of the rest of Virginia, went into Jim Crow and things like that, and certainly Phoebus did too. But they had a little more balance.
Yeah, and that's we look at other places on the peninsula at that time, and even in Phoebus we had churches. The Methodist church that's there now was anti-slavery. Before the Civil War, which is it's a rare thing in the South to see that. You just don't see it. And we did see signs for, segregation signs in like the early 1900s, but it was I found one, and we're looking at other places and it's everywhere. It's on giant billboards and sides of buildings in other towns, but in Phoebus, you have a lot of African-American business owners there that are owning saloons, and there's just a lot of, people. It's not just separate but equal. It's like really a community of people that kind of respect each other at that time, it seems.
It's very interesting. And certainly after the Civil War, you do have these sort of effects from Fort Monroe and effects from Hampton University that sort of bracket the city and that change it. So
yeah, actually, Hampton Institute after the Civil War was a tourist attraction. So when people were coming to Fort Monroe, there was the Hygeia and the Chamberlain, these very wealthy hotels, and people were taking little day trips into Phoebus to see the bars and see Hampton Institute and St. John's Church in Hampton. So it's all these things, and then Buckrow obviously is kind of it's growing in the early 1900s too.
Yeah, and there's influences to Phoebus because it's not that far.
Yeah.
Well, my favorite piece of lore is the saloons and that era. Talk about that a little bit, how that evolved and how prevalent and pervasive it was.
Yeah, so we were doing research on this, and what we hear is, there are 52 saloons in 1900, but there were actually more before 1900. So, there were in 1898, we were seeing as many as 83 saloons in Phoebus for a town that has 1,500 to 2,000 people in it. So it's, I've been looking at New Orleans and San Francisco and other places in the world at that time to see per capita, what are the numbers? And I can't imagine there are more per capita saloons than anywhere than Phoebus was at that time. But one of the reasons was we had, Fort Monroe on one end, which was all the soldiers coming through there quite a bit. Spanish-American War.
It was much bigger. I mean, I know it in my day, but it was a huge base at that time.
It was.
And ports were big, and still naval.
It was the center of the world, and you had all these tourists there. And then you had, on the other end, you had the Old Soldiers Home, which is the VA that's there now. But there were, thousands of Civil War veterans that were there after the war. So you had kind of military on both ends.
And they were mobile enough, often to come into town, I guess, especially when they got their checks.
Yeah, so they had their checks, and even the military banned liquor sales at the VA. They banned liquor sales at Fort Monroe because it was a military base in 1901. So that even expanded, people coming to the saloons in Phoebus even more.
So in some ways, it sort of contributed to it. But I understand drinking was a rampant problem then, and their original goal was to clamp down on it. And instead, I think they just concentrated it.
They did, and it was kind of unintentional. They were trying to keep people from getting drunk, and and one of the side effects was especially the Soldiers' Home, they were making money about equivalent of about $300,000 a month
to
2018 dollars, but it was supporting the home. And then when the military shut that down, everybody went outside. They lost that stream of income, and it hurt them for a couple of years. So it's kind of unintentional consequences, and it also sent more soldiers out to drink whiskey and what they called the vile den of Phoebus.
Well, talk about why it was such a vile den. It was not just the drinking. There was a whole lot else going on.
So, one of the key periods we were looking at, it was 1898. So the Spanish-American War was going on. Which
is one we really don't think about that much.
We don't think about it at all.
But it was huge.
But everybody was leaving from the East Coast, and Fort Monroe was kind of the center of the world at that time. So everybody's, thousands of soldiers are coming in and coming back, blowing off steam in Phoebus and kind of thinking they can get away with anything. In 1898 and in June through October, there were just numerous riots with all those soldiers coming in, and especially we were looking at this contingent of Maryland volunteers that were down, and they got into a fight in June, and 75 were arrested. They got in a fight with their own military. The regulars from Fort Monroe were in Phoebus with them, and they were making fun of the Maryland volunteers for lack of training and making fun of Maryland, the state. And so these guys got in a huge bar fight that went on like all night. And the military came in and arrested 75 soldiers, mostly from Maryland. And then in August of 1898, there was another major riot there. And the police in Phoebus arrested 4 Maryland volunteers after this riot and took them to prison. Word got back to Fort Monroe, and this group of Maryland soldiers, they called it a soldier mob, came with, so they said there was even a battering ram involved in this, but they went to the prison to break their comrades out, and the Sheriff Curtis, the Phoebus sheriff, deputized a whole bunch, he says a score, but it was 12 to 15 soldiers, or 12 to 15 citizens.
Right.
And one of the things that set off the Maryland soldiers was the fact that they were integrated.
And that brings us back to that race and how Phoebus was different. And, stereotypically, people think of Maryland as the North and Virginia as the South. But here, at least, it flipped the conventional attitudes, which I think are stereotypical anyway. But, they use that as an excuse. But either way, it inflamed that particular regiment.
That regiment wrote an article, an article to the Daily Press the next day, and was saying that there wouldn't have been problems except for the police force was integrated in the town. It was the deputies that were brought in, but there wouldn't have been a problem except for that. And they said that the African Americans in town had teamed up with the saloon owners, and what they didn't know was, a lot of the African Americans were saloon
We're
owners.
the saloon owners, right?
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Well, and that, it's a different military back then than what we see today.
And there were volunteers.
And they didn't
and,
have control,
exactly.
and the way things are now. And it is fascinating. So you see these civilians kind of arming themselves from from the marauding, rioting, drunken army at that time. It really. It feels colorful, and I think we like to kind of romanticize. It's like we romanticize pirates, we romanticize the saloons and the kind of cool vibe at the time. But it was pretty scary. It was and pretty darn violent.
It was dangerous and violent, and there were a lot of things that we didn't put in the book that we saw that were just murders that were going on, and the what they called lewd women and the bawdy houses and all these things.
Quite a few bawdy houses, I hear. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, red light districts and.
And so Phoebus goes through this period of kind of trying to clean itself up, and of course goes through Prohibition.
Yeah.
But it was not necessarily the most obedient to that state and federal law.
Yeah, it's really interesting that in 1900 they rebrand the town as Phoebus. It was called that before a little, with Harrison Phoebus brought the railroad in, was named after him. Even a little bit earlier than that, but they officially dedicated it in April.
He was
1900.
kind of everything in the town at that time. It sounded like.
He was a really dynamic guy, and was actually in talks with the Greenbrier in West Virginia to actually take that over and make it into the Hygeia, for the east.
Yeah.
Or for the west. Sorry, for the west, out for the mountains.
At least for a short time, at least, kind of partner hotels where you could vacation in the mountains in the springs, or you could vacation here at the lovely beach. Yeah,
and it's so they rebrand the town in 1900. The Spanish-American War is over. The violence has kind of receded at that point. Things have gotten better. Interesting thing though is like a lot of the town council members are all saloon owners. So they're tasked with cleaning up the town. Meanwhile, their livelihoods.
Right.
And the interesting thing, the first election in 1901 was 2 African Americans were elected to the town council, which is for Virginia at that time is very rare.
Yeah, there was a short bout there during Reconstruction, but to happen that early, I think, is a huge statement.
Yeah, and so we're reading in the Phoebus Sentinel, just how respected they were in the town and how everybody, the trustee had the most expensive house in the town that I mentioned, but this other guy named N.C. Barnes was just completely respected by all classes, all races, and led the town for quite up until 1909. So
how does Phoebus get through the Prohibition era?
So it's kind of a mixed bag. So I think, looking through the papers, there are no arrests in the first month. So October 1916 comes around, and the Prohibition comes to Virginia 3 years before it does the rest of the state or rest of the country. And so they don't arrest anybody the first month, and the police come in and they release this to the town council. That into the first month, there's been no arrest. And people are kind of dumbfounded, but like, okay, well, this is great, And then the Daily Press comes out with an article like mocking the town, like Phoebus is totally clean. There's not a single arrest, and one of the things that we see is there's still no arrest even later on. The bigger arrests are made by the Department of Justice and those kind of organizations.
It takes the feds, the revenuers, or whatever you want to call them, to move in and begin to really make that happen.
And Mayor Dixon, and there are a couple different characters in this, but they are accused of bribery, and there's a big scandal, and they're put on trial in 1922, and it's a mistrial, and then they get another trial, and they're found not guilty. But
hey, trial your peers.
Exactly. Yeah. So it seems like they did a lot of, there are a lot of things going on at that time that look suspicious, but they don't charge them with anything. But that whole mayor and his staff, everybody is voted out right after that, like a few months later, and Mayor Carney comes in at that point and really kind of has a little bit of a reform, and we see more arrest and more trials going on at that time for alcohol.
So what was kind of that? Was that the heyday of Phoebus? Would you say it was earlier during the Hygeia and during that grand hotel sort of period, or has Phoebus had a lot of heydays?
There's like several heydays. I would say that for the interesting part in the book where it was the 1898. So You've got kind of everything going on. You have Civil War veterans, and you have the Spanish-American War, and the saloons, and all this stuff is kind of not the place you probably want to live at that time, but that's, and then all the way up till in the 20s, with Prohibition kind of taking effect and trying to figure out how that's going to work. It seems like they stabilize after that point, and there's enough money coming in from the military and from the veterans and from all these other sources that even the Great Depression doesn't really impact them very much.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't gotten that far.
Okay, sorry.
So did you substantiate the Al Capone rumor at all? Is there a way to do that? I mean, was he...
So we've seen a lot of different organized crime figures, but they're very low level that we could, at least what we could research in the papers and from talking to people. But there are reports that Al Capone was in Hampton. It'd come to Phoebus. People like Minnesota Fats and gambling rings were kind of coming through, and we see a lot more arrests after Prohibition starts for gambling too. So then some of the crime moves into pool halls, and there's a push to take, they've coated all the windows with black paint and put them behind, and they want glass for some of those things so they can see what's going on.
See what's going on in there.
Yeah, but that's one thing that we're talking with a lot of people that have those connections, and we do know there were mob ties in Phoebus for sure, but I didn't want to put that in the book until we had more proof, and this is kind of a living book that we're updating as we get more information.
Is it? I was going to ask.
It is, yeah.
It is, I will say, a very different kind of history book. It is not there are facts and there are dates, but it's driven by stories.
Yes.
And I think that makes it very, very readable.
Yeah, I think that the downside to just, the upside and the downside to moving here is it's all fresh, and you're coming in with new eyes on some of these stories and these kind of legends that the people in Phoebus have. And some of the downsides is we missed some of the more important people, or some of the stories that, if you're not looking for it, you don't see it. So we're trying to add some of that in too.
And you keep saying we, so does this mean we should be crediting your wife with some of that?
I think so. My wife, she took a lot of photos in here, and she set up a lot of the meetings, with people to talk to them. And so she's played a major role in putting the book together. My daughter's actually a history major and teaches Latin in Arizona, and she did the editing for the book. I have a major problem with commas, it turns out.
Well, it's great that this could be a family kind of project, because I'm sure it took you a while, although you're indicating to me it didn't take nearly as long as I would have thought.
Yeah, so we were collecting the photos starting in September, October, and I had enough photos to really it was going to be more of a photo book and kind of telling the history with photos like an Arcadia would or something. And when we started talking to Daily Press and finding some of the articles in there, we were able to go back and piece a lot more of this together. And then we talked to the Phoebus family, and anyway, just a lot of great stories that we were able to go back and really put it all together, as much as we could.
Well, tell me, we were talking a little bit before this started, but how you ended up in Phoebus? Why are you here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my wife, we lived here back in the mid-'90s with the Air Force, and lived in Hampton off of Mercury Boulevard, actually just within walking distance of here, and always loved the area. We've lived all over the world on multiple continents, and this is the only place that we lived in that we really both agreed that we wanted to move back to. And so when my son graduated from high school in the summer last year, we decided to put down roots here and move down here. And so we're really excited to be back. And Phoebus is a great community, and bought an old Victorian house there, and that's kind of how all this started, was the research on the house.
Was it already renovated, or are you guys having to do a lot of that?
It was already renovated. So after the hurricane in 2003, they really renovated the entire house and repainted and it's as close to perfect from 1900 as it could be.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things I notice is that sometimes people who aren't born here dive into this history, and Greg Siegel and With. I mean,
sure.
Is it one of these things where you almost have to see it from the outside to appreciate it? Do people who've been here all their lives just not get it? Yeah,
and when we were living here, I didn't really get it. We went to Fort Monroe all the time and walked around. We did all that, but I was at a party in Washington D.C. and they're like, "Oh, you lived in Hampton? That's interesting. why was the Union like so far, how did they get there when DC's up here, and how, and so we started just talking that out, and I was like, that's kind of interesting. And then, we've been kind of following it from afar, and kind of all the developments with it shutting down in 2011, and kind of the history it played in the, in Hampton, and just always found that interesting. And with the book, we just started seeing all these kind of firsts for Phoebus. That it was the first Union camp, Union position in the South during the Civil War. It's like it's amazing, and like I never see that in Hampton.
Well, it's not like they came in and occupied it. Like
no,
they had it to begin with.
They did.
They just didn't leave.
Well, they were in Fort Monroe, and they were reinforcing with 5,000 troops, and they didn't have enough water to provide for So then they came across to Phoebus, and the house is still there, the Willowdale, and there's a well there that the Union ships were just filling up, right from the water, and all that is something that people, they know it's there, and they might have seen a picture, but when you start looking at the scale and the kind of the colorful people that were there, and then the contraband decision and the slaves kind of, the freed community there for and we, it's not in a book either, but we started talking to John Quarlestein, who's a really animated guy and then knows his history for Hampton Roads. And I'm asking him for, the freed slave community. I'm like, I hear Slabtown in Phoebus, I hear Slabtown in Hampton. Like, he's like, there's a Slabtown in both. Phoebus was first. I'm like, well, does that make it the first?
It was right in or outside the gates, and it just kept, so many people came that they were all over. Yeah,
so we were asking, is the first, freed slave community here, which would make it the first in the South, because there were no other places at that time. And so just kind of talking with him,
maybe
it's like
official, I mean, Great Dismal Swamp, I think, was home to a lot of escapees because no one could get in and get them and find them, and there were probably some other communities, but
but
that was more official. They were allowed to live openly. Sure. Interesting. So you're going to write more?
We're going to. I think we're right now. I'm actually a meteorologist by background, so I'm looking at history, kind of keeping this updated, and then looking at doing a history of the 1933 hurricane and kind of the impact on Hampton.
Oh, that would be fascinating. Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to more, and I do want to tell people your first talk at the History Museum, I'm told, reached capacity and people had to be turned away, and you're coming back.
It's a good problem.
You will also be at various events in Phoebus to sign your book, and I hope talk about your book, tell these stories.
Yeah, I think right now we are looking at the Hampton History Museum, a follow-up for the 1900 to about, during the Prohibition era.
Yeah, you can't skip that part.
So we're not going to skip that. We're going to kind of focus on that, and that'll be March 4th from 7 to 8. And then I think at Sly Clyde's and some of the other bars in Phoebus, we're looking at doing.
You got to hit the Saloons, right?
We are. I mean, it seems like it's a good mix.
Isn't that a great building? The building that Sly Clyde is in, and the renovations that they've done, and how because it was his family, of course, really started with, let's preserve the building and use it, not here's this business idea I have. It's more like, how can we use?
I live like right around the corner from that, and it's just exciting to see cars there and like activity and people out on the streets and Sly Clyde's. It's
the new restaurant
wonderful.
Using the Fuller's name. I know they're not connected, but it does sort of bring that tradition back.
It feels alive out there for sure. Like a lot of new restaurants, a lot of new energy. We just moved here, but you can see it already in 6 months. Kind of how it's really grown.
Well, it's very exciting. So, Tim, we hope you'll stay around and write some more and help us tell these stories. I'm gonna come here too. Been here a little longer than you have, but I think sometimes people have heard these stories growing up and don't
understand how important they are.
Yeah. It's sort of like Margaret Lee Shetterly, who grew up her whole life around the female mathematicians at NASA and the African Americans and that whole community, and didn't realize how unique it was until she got out for a while. And her husband is saying like, "Hey, that's a big deal," and you kind of miss that when you've been here or your family's been here or whatever.
Yeah. So there's plenty of more stories to tell, I'm sure.
So where can we get your book, Tim?
So they're available at the Hampton History Museum in downtown Hampton, and then we've got them all at Robert's Antiques and a whole bunch of other restaurants and places in Phoebus too. If you ask around there, you'll be able to find one.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your stories.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for your time.
And thank you for watching. I hope you will get a copy of this book. There are a lot of photographs, and that really enhances the stories he's telling. So no matter how much he says, you really do need to get the book, leaf through it. It is not like a boring history book. It's very easy to read, very fun, and because of the way it's chaptered out in time frames, you can start at the end, start at the middle, you can just read whatever period interests you first. And again, thanks for watching.